All right, hello everyone. Right away, I want to thank you for coming back to my channel for another video. Today, we are talking about the assigned reading for the third week of the Soul course I'm teaching at Johns Hopkins University in the fall of 2020. The course is titled Meanings to Being, Using Reading and Writing to Author the Self. Last week, we read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, a text I assigned with the hope of setting the tone for the remainder of this semester. I wanted to give you some idea of the stakes. Talking about all of the ways in which we can improve ourselves, I think tends to be a little cliche. And to talk about it, we have to not only be willing to sound cliche, I think, but we have to be in touch with what lies behind the, let's say, cliche facade. And I think it tends to be, when we look at Man's Search for Meaning, for example, something that is very serious and worth our time. So these are the stakes as Frankl lays them out for us. We get one shot at life. We don't get to avoid tragedy. At some point, we will have to be strong. And when the time comes for us to be strong, it's essential that we have some interpretational framework to fall back on. And I think that as your teacher, the best thing I can do for you is to try to build you up and try to give you some way of looking at, what are, in this case, my passions, being reading and writing, in a way that's as meaningful and as universally applicable as can possibly be managed. So like I've already said, last week we discussed Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. This week we're reading three texts. We're reading excerpts from First They Killed My Father, we're reading The Management of Grief, and A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And for those of you who happen to have just come across the videos, I'll put the link to all of the texts that we're looking at in the description down below. Okay, so there are a few questions that I want to answer right away. The first, why did I assign these readings? I assigned these readings because I wanted to mimic a process we saw in Man's Search for Meaning. If you remember from last week, when we looked at Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl basically had three organizing principles or three stages that gave form to the text itself. They were the stages the prisoner in a concentration camp was expected to experience following his or her arrival. The first stage was shock, following the prisoner's initial admission phase to the camp, when they were still adjusting. The prisoner lost their identity and began growing especially curious about what the future might hold, either good or bad. But the main thing to remember is the first stage has to do with shock. The second, Frankl described as an emotional deadening, which sounds grim, and I think that's really because it is. It involved the detachment of oneself from the present situation. The prisoner was no longer emotionally invested in the ugliness and the brutality unfolding in the world around them. And the third stage is what Frankl called depersonalization, which usually, he said, follows the prisoner's release from camp, at which point the prisoner isn't able to realize what they've just been through. They have to kind of disconnect themselves from what has happened to them in order to live a normal life, as Frankl called it. So those were the three organizing ideas guiding Frankl's book. And if you noticed, there are three assigned readings this week. There was First They Killed My Father, The Management of Grief, and A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. So I'll say this, organized the way they are, the order that I just repeated, I think they mimic the process, the stages that Frankl outlined. This is one of the ways Frankl's process becomes more than circumstantial, let's say, which is to say it's a way in which it becomes more widely applicable. So when we think about Man's Search for Meaning, we need to think about how we can take the unique set of circumstances being, Frankl's imprisonment in a concentration camp, how we can take those unique circumstances and apply them to our everyday life. To do that requires conceptualizing what Frankl has laid out as being, some kind of a kind of metaphor, and I think that's really what it can function as if you allow it to. Being a prisoner in a concentration camp functions as It's like obviously a very extreme example, but it shares some metaphorical relationship with what it means to contend with your suffering. All of that is to say that I've tried to organize a reading list this week that echoes the Frankl stages that I previously listed. And I think the texts we're looking at this week really do just that. First They Killed My Father, in my opinion, matches up nicely with Frankl's idea of shock. Things, used to be one way. Suddenly, the life of the person involved is dramatically changed and they have to reorient themselves. And I think we see that in First They Killed My Father, which I'll talk in greater detail in some future video, but for now I'll just kind of give a brief overview. Because obviously the book does more than just outline one moment where the protagonist is shocked. Obviously it does more than that, but I've only assigned 2 chapters for a reason. I assigned the chapter titled Takeover and the chapter titled Evacuation. And I did that because I think the chapters speak to another archetypal experience when any sort of suffering rears its head in our direction. I've mentioned in some of our other classes that my goal for this course as a whole is to teach you something that's going to be of value to you in the future. I've organized the readings to this end, to teach you something about how to process and how to contend with your suffering. And it's something that I think I'm pulling straight from the Frankl itself. So, I can't necessarily take credit for this idea. It's just something that I feel very strongly about trying to convey to you. I'm pulling it from the Frankl because, like I said last week, the value of a book like Man's Search for Meaning is that it's something that you can turn to when tragedy does strike. I think it's as close to a religious text as you can find. And I mentioned, teaching you something that will help you in the years beyond this class, because, like I've mentioned previously, someday some series of events is going to unfold before you, and it will threaten to, if not take you out, to at least seriously inhibit your progress. And in those moments, I think that it becomes invaluable to have access to books like Man's Search for Meaning and the readings that we're looking at this week. But talking specifically about First They Killed My Father, we have Takeover and we have Evacuation, these 2 chapters. The Takeover chapter symbolizes something archetypal about human experience, which I will cover in a future video. And the idea is basically that when it rains, it pours. When the suffering comes, it really comes. There isn't, I don't think there's any better way to put it. When tragedy strikes, symbolically speaking, it is as though something were taking over, the name of the chapter. Emotionally, it can be as though a hostile force were invading. And I think that's another kind of analogy that we can take from the text itself and apply it to the real world, to our own lives. And I chose the Evacuation chapter because, having read Man's Search for Meaning, I think, at least symbolically speaking, once again, we can give form to a useful pattern structure using this chapter. When tragedy rolls in, when some negative external stimuli takes over, evacuation is as universally useful and applicable as any plan you could come up with, regardless of whether or not it's a literal evacuation or nothing more than a symbolic evacuation. And again, I'll cover this in more detail in a future video. Next up, we have The Management of Grief. This is the first work of fiction we're reading in this class, and I think it's a lot to chew. It's a tough read to work through. The story revolves around a grieving widow and mother who has just lost her children and her husband in a terrorist attack. The woman is numb. She's overcome by grief, hence the title. And I've asked you to read this short story second because I think it demonstrates what follows the first phase of the camp prisoner, which I just talked about. It follows or at least we can conceptualize it as something that might follow the first phase of shock. Again, symbolically speaking, being in a concentration camp is it's the metaphorical equivalent of being a prisoner to your own suffering. It's an analogy that we can create and we can use to kind of color how we interact with tragedy. And what does it mean to be a prisoner to your own suffering? I think that it means that your suffering paralyzes you in a way. I think you kind of become, or run the risk at least, of becoming frozen in time. And I'm not suggesting that this is definitely going to happen to you when tragedy does eventually strike. I obviously hope that it doesn't. But I chose the short story, The Management of Grief, because I think it offers us an example of what Frankl's second step looks like in an environment that's removed from a concentration camp. Obviously, it's still an extreme example. Statistically speaking, a terrorist attack isn't something most people are likely to experience first or second hand, but it's being dealt with in the story, and I think that it kind of works towards something that speaks to, some universal human way of processing grief and suffering, maybe more generally. The point of having you read the story is more so concerned with understanding what grief that threatens to take you out looks like and how you can understand the process of dealing with it. Hopefully, you kind of get some idea of what I'm doing by this point as far as how the organization of the texts for this week is concerned. I'm not suggesting everyone will have to deal with the kind of grief that we see exhibited in, the Frankl, or in First They Killed My Father, or in The Management of Grief. I hope none of you have to. But in the event that you have no choice but to face something difficult, I want you to have a plan or some reference point to rely on. And I think, just as a kind of side note, I think that's one of the beauties of fiction, being able to draw on vividly hallucinated life experience as though it were your own. There's plenty to be learned from The Management of Grief, and that's why I've assigned it. I can't tell you exactly what there is to be learned. It kind of depends on, what you bring to the text and, what you find in it. But I do think that there's plenty there. When it comes to grief, you can find whatever it is that you're looking for in The Management of Grief. And the last text we read for this week, but certainly not the least, was a story by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And for those who don't know, and even for those who do, Marquez was one of the greatest fiction writers of the 20th century. If you want to read somebody whose work will touch you and follow you, I think Marquez is among the best. Okay, so Marquez is a great storyteller. Why am I talking to you about this? I'm talking to you about it because one of the many reasons this story is so beautiful, in my opinion, is because it reveals something about human nature to us. And it has to do with the third stage in man's search for meaning as well. So the story can teach us a number of things, but what jumps out to me is what it can teach us about faith and about hope. Ideas that we first started discussing while we were reading the Frankl. And again, this is something I'll talk about in more detail in a future video, but I think we can learn from, the young couple that we see in the story. We can learn from the crowd, and we can learn from the very old man with enormous wings. And I think Marquez's story pertains to the Frankl because there is some depersonalizing quality to the end. And I don't want to give too much away because it is a short story. It's only about, I want to say 3 or 4 pages, I think. So I'll kind of save some of that for next time and I'll talk about it in a future video. But I really do see a tight link between the arc of the story and Frankl's idea of depersonalization. And I think that's everything I've got for now. Before you go, I want to thank you, my wonderful viewer, for sticking with me to the end. I also want to thank my video editors, Bach and Joe. I couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you. And again, I will thank you, my wonderful viewer. If you found this video interesting or helpful or useful, I ask that you please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Okay, Thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.